everybody. It is Saturday night at 10 o'clock Eastern Time. I am not in the Eastern Time Zone. If you're a longtime viewer of Starfleet Tactical, you know that I am Chris Weave. This is my brother, DeLon. And if DeLon's here and we've got this set up, it means that I'm doing the show from my brother's house, which means that I'm visiting my family in Des Moines. So DeLon, what have you been up to?
A lot of work.
A lot of work.
Two kids in college, that sort of thing.
I understand. I'm in the sort of the same boat. So, Lissa, why don't you come on for just a second? What have you been up to?
I've been playing tabletops, and today I got to be 4 raccoons in a starry cloak with a pointy hat and glasses. It was freaking hilarious. I got to cast Yeet today.
Well, I'm glad that you had a good time. No, sorry, I've got a little bit of a cough. It's the same cough that I've had forever and ever. Most of the time it's gone now, but every now and then it comes back. So I drove to Des Moines yesterday, and I'm going back to Dayton tomorrow. So it's just a quick show, quick trip. Hello, everybody. I see a lot of the usual suspects here as always. I'm glad to see you guys. One of the people we do not have here, obviously, is Pat. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure what Pat's doing tonight, but he just said he wasn't available. So I decided that what I would do is I've had on the back burner for a while an idea, and I decided to go ahead and do it. But you know what? It just occurred to me, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I do that, I should talk a little bit about the survey. Well, actually, you know what? Before the survey, I should ask DeLon. So DeLon is my younger brother. DeLon has known me his entire life. I've known him for slightly longer than that. DeLon,
give me 1 second. I'm going to copy the
Sorry,
survey.
what?
I said I'm copying the survey, so it'll be off the bottom for a second.
Okay. So, DeLon, have you ever heard me say, even once, that I speak for my employer?
No, but there have been a couple of times you've tried doing that with me and the other 2 siblings.
So I do not speak for my employer.
He doesn't really talk for us either.
Yeah.
I think you need a fan for that burn, Chris.
I'll be fine. So in any event, so that was issue number 1. I don't speak for my employer. Issue number 2 is, as you can see, there's a banner in the bottom of the screen that has a Survey Monkey survey. So last week I said that Pat and I were talking and we want to do a watch along. And so the idea behind the watch along is we'll pick some TV show, we'll sort of start at the beginning, and we'll do 5 episodes at a time. And then like once a month, we'll say, okay, for next month's episodes are the following 5 episodes of whatever the show is, and then we'll have us. There are people in the other room.
Please excuse
Apparently, you can't pick it up. Gosh.
That's my wife, a good friend, and my son all play in sequence, and they're competitive, to say the least. Especially my wife.
I can see that.
Can you remind them that
I will remind them.
So in any event, there's the plan is that we'll say like, okay, for the month of May, the 5 episodes are such and such, and then we'll Pat and I will sit down and we'll talk about them. We'll do the Starfleet Tactical treatment on them, and you guys can all watch along too. And so there's I put a survey together of where we're going to start. It's got only 2 questions. One is, which shows would you like to see? And the other one, you can check as many as you want. You can check them all if you want. And then the other one, other part of the survey is, which 3 options would you like us to start with? Now, our default, everything else being equal, will generally follow the results of the survey. If left to our own devices, we'll probably start with Space Above and Beyond. It's a relatively short series. We could probably kill it off in about 3 months, because I don't think there was many more than, I think there was like 12 episodes. I could be wrong. It could be a little bit more than that, but we should be able to kill it off in 3 months or so. So that's sort of our default going in. And the other thing is we pretty much know that there's tactical space combat in pretty much every episode. And or at least every other episode. So it's a good target-rich environment from that standpoint. So we'll run this through the rest of March, and then sometime in April we'll announce when we're starting, exactly when we're starting, and we'll start doing that. And so the other thing is I'm going to be doing a lot of traveling in May, so there's a good chance that we may not have as many shows on in May because I'll just be on the road a lot. It might not be feasible to do it. But the plan, that's our plan going forward. But our plan for tonight is that I'm going to go back to a topic that I've talked about a couple of times in the past, and I've periodically said that I wanted to revisit. And I decided now is a good time to do that. So let me get this all set up. I'm moving StreamYard around so that I can be looking at the presentation. So the presentation today is going to be, okay, some quick announcements. I'm still behind in the comments, so I'll get caught up in that. Starfleet Tactical Watch Along Survey, I already talked about that. The usual caveats about this is not my employer's opinion. It applies to everybody, not just me. Also, I've never actually been a naval officer. I've spent a lot of time working with the Navy, but I've never actually been in the Navy. It's a TV show. It's also a vehicle for discussion about interesting topics. Please don't let anything I say prevent you from enjoying some piece of science fiction. That is not my intent. I'm hoping to add to your enjoyment because you know more about it. I'm not trying to undermine anybody's enjoyment. And last but not least, anytime I use an image, I try to get stuff that's fair use if possible. But, Paramount, please don't sue me. Okay, so I'm going to go back and do some talking about targeting. So you may recall a while back, I talked about, there was a slide I had called A Useful Observation, and it was something that Frank Chadwick had read as part of the designer notes for the board game Star Cruiser, which is the war game associated with the 2300 RPG. It came out in the late 1980s. And I always used to say, there's a little note at the bottom, you'll see it in just a second, that Bob Work, when he was the Undersecretary of the Navy, he had a presentation on air-sea battle that was very similar. And that these things all applied to science fiction. So I decided that being solo today, that I wanted to re-examine some of that stuff. So that's the plan for tonight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Frank Chadwick and Robert Work. Then I'm going to go revisit that slide, that useful observation slide, and talk about it a little bit. And then I'm going to go through some of the stuff that Bob Work said that applies to what Frank Chadwick said. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about science fiction media, including Star Trek. Now, I suspect this may end up as a two-parter because this is exactly the kind of topic that I'll do. And then when I'm listening to it the following week, it's like, oh, I should have said this, or I should have said that, or there's this other thing I should have talked about, et cetera, et cetera. There is, so when all is said and done, I think there's a very good chance I may come back to this topic at some point in the future. So this is probably not the end of a conversation. It's probably the beginning of a conversation on this topic. So a few caveats to start off with, though. This is one of those instances where the question, which Star Trek am I talking about, applies. Am I talking about TV shows, movies, tech manuals, computer games, role-playing games, etc.? So and in all of those fields, there's the stuff that's official, there's the stuff that's unofficial, there's some fan-produced stuff that covers some interesting time periods. Time periods in general is a big question because things change. We've got a couple of 100 years of Star Trek time periods to go through, and things change over time. Did it later change? Was it retconned or ignored by later writers? How do we know, what exactly is the evidence on any particular thing? And so in the end, as you can see in the right-hand side there, I have a tendency to go back to the original series, Next Gen with sort of some flavoring from especially Deep Space Nine, and the opinions of Rick Sternbach and Mike Okuda on the one hand, and Pat Doyle and Andy Presby on the other. And I sort of mix it all up, and I've got a funnel there. It should probably actually be like a mixer of some sort, a blender. I blend that all up, and then out pops whatever headcanon I have in my head. So from that standpoint, yeah, everybody's going to be able to point to an episode that seems to contradict something I said. I'm fully expecting that, but that's just totally the way it works out in this show, right? That's the way that Star Trek works out. I really haven't had time to research this in full. I've gone through a little bit, but I can't say that I've specifically tracked down episodes of the show. Really wish Pat was here, because Pat is way more up on the details of all the various shows than I am at this point. And so Pat can usually think of specific episodes by name, but he's not here, so I haven't had a chance to go back and do that type of research myself. I spent most of my time on the Bob Work and Frank Chadwick end of things, not on the Star Trek end of things. This is an overview. I'm leaving a lot of money on the table. I'm not talking about how drive systems affect this, and it does. I'm not talking about how the specific targeting systems work. Frankly, we don't know a whole lot about all that. But I'm not talking about the phenomenology of the targeting systems, exactly what the sensors use, et cetera. There's all sorts of things that I'm just not covering. And so this could be a much more in-depth article than it is. And maybe sometimes I'll do that. And we've also got a relatively small sample size in that, we don't necessarily see everything that might be true in the universe, because it just didn't make it to the screen. So those are the caveats in general. Okay, so let's talk about Frank Chadwick for a little bit. Frank co-founded Game Designers Workshop in early 1970s, if I remember correctly. They published historical and science fiction war games. They published role-playing games. They had a magazine. They did a couple of different magazines over their run. They did a lot of stuff, but if you had to narrow it down, probably three things they're known for. They're known for historical. They're known for various historical war games. They've done the various versions of Traveler. That's one of the things that might appeal to straight stick science fiction fans. And they also did the 2300 RPG and the Star Cruiser war game that came along with it, including the designer notes that I'm going to talk about in just a second. Frank was the designer of Star Cruiser, but he was primarily known for his historical war game designs. Mark Miller was the main guy behind Traveler with Lauren Weissman. John Harshman was there for a bunch of stuff in the early years. I never met him. I don't know whatever happened to him. But Frank sort of was, the impression I get was Frank had the stick for everything else, and Mark sort of ran Traveler. And then 2300 came along, and it was sort of, Frank was more involved with 2300, I think. These days, he spends a lot of time writing fiction, and he's the author of Chain of Command and Ship of Destiny, which I've already talked about a couple of different times. Pat told me about these. I knew that they existed. He said I should read them sooner rather than later. I did, and they were fantastic. I recommend them without reservation whatsoever. Give you the little summary there of them. And there's a couple of other books that are set in the same universe. They're sort of tech noir books featuring a character named Sasha Niradno. I'd love to see more books in either sequence here, either in the Bitka sequence, which is the Chain of Command sequence, or in the Niradno sequence. So that's what I'd really like to see. Good stuff, worth the effort on your part. Okay, Bob Work. So Bob Work was a United States Marine. He retired as a colonel in like 1991-ish or 2001-ish, sorry. 27 years of service. He was commissioned in 1974. His undergraduate degree was in biology. I forget where he did Naval ROTC, but then he got an MS in systems management and an MS in space system operations from the Naval Postgraduate School. He was Undersecretary of the Navy, and then he went off to work at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments as a senior fellow, followed by being the VP there, one of the VPs, and then he got tapped to be the Deputy Secretary of Defense from 2014 to 2017. And then after that, he went to the Center for New American Security, and he was the CEO there for a while, and I've kind of lost lock on where he is right now. He's a wargamer. He did a lot of wargaming professionally. He did a lot of wargaming for other, for hobby wargaming, as far as I understand. So I've never actually met him myself. It came close one time. He was supposed to come and talk at a small conference that I attend on a regular basis. But at the last second, he needed to talk to the Secretary of Defense. And for some reason, he decided that he was going to keep his meeting with the SecDef and send his deputy to come and talk to us instead. In 2010, when he was Undersecretary of the Navy, he did this presentation that I'm going to talk a little bit about called Air-Sea Battle, Power Projection in the Mature Guided Munitions Era. So this was the time of the third offset strategy. This was the time of, spent a lot of time talking about battle networks in this presentation. I'm not really going to go into the battle network side of things. I'm going to basically just limit myself to the pieces where he directly overlaps with Frank Chadwick. I'd go through the entire presentation, but the entire presentation is something like 20, 30 slides. It's kind of long. And so I decided, rather than try to explain everything that he said, I didn't actually see the presentation, I've only read it, that I would limit myself to just talking about the stuff that overlapped with Chadwick. I'm going to basically, I started off by doing a cut and paste from his slides, and then I would do, I clean it up just a little bit to make it fit on the slide a little bit better. So there is some paraphrasing on my part, but I worked hard to try not to change the meaning of this. Please feel free to go and download it. You can get it from the internet. That's where I got it. In fact, Chris Carlson, I believe, has a copy of it on the Admiralty Trilogy website. So you can go and download it and read it yourself. Okay, so Chadwick's useful observation is that tactical combat is largely about targeting. There are two ways to improve your targeting. You can either increase the precision of the fire so that each shot is more accurate, or you can increase the volume of the fire and play the probability game. If you throw more fire down range, there's a greater probability that one of them will hit. You can increase the precision of fire by improving your knowledge of the enemy's position so that you're doing a better job of shooting where the enemy is. The performance of your weapon, and that means, like, for instance, if you rifle the barrel of your gun, the bullet will spin as it moves through the air, and if it's spinning, it will fly in a straighter trajectory, and you will get it will have better performance, it'll have longer range, etc. Or you can increase weapon control. Basically, you can do a better job of aiming, is basically what that means. You can increase the volume of fire by increasing either the rate of fire or the number of guns. And that gets into some of the ship design stuff that I talked about back when I spent all that time talking about Winchell Chung and the triangle ship design thing, right? As ships got bigger and as armor got better and engines got better, as armor got better, it decreased in relative weight compared to the size of the ship. As ships got better, the volume available increased. As propulsion got better, you needed less space to move the ship. The propulsion spaces could get smaller, although realistically, what really happened was ships got faster. The propulsion spaces, if anything, got bigger. The ships got faster, but the main thing is that the size of the ships got better, and that meant that you can put more guns on it, right? So if you go back to all that triangle stuff that I did like 40 episodes ago, you can get smart on that. On the defense, you can counter this by decreasing the precision of fire, so you can do things to make the other guy's fire less effective, or you can decrease the effective volume of fire by armoring it. So in other words, if the hit doesn't count because it bounces off the armor, it's the same as not getting hit effectively. And so those are the different ways you can do it. And on the right-hand side, hopefully you've all been reading that while I've been talking about the stuff on the left-hand side, you can see the actual words that Frank Chadwick used in the Star Cruiser designer notes back in 1987, and that I distilled this out of. So let's go through work. Work says that unguided munitions warfare had an inherent bias towards mass. Now, What does he mean by unguided munitions warfare? You can really sort of view the world, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, as World War II and before, and World War II and after. Notice how World War II is kind of in both groups, and that's because World War II was kind of where all this changed. World War II was really the first place you started seeing guided munitions. You had things like radio-controlled bombs. You had the Japanese deployed thousands of guided missiles. Do you know what the name of those guys? Do you ever hear about this? You know what the name of those guided missiles were?
Oh, the kamikaze pilots.
Kamikazes. Kamikazes are in effect guided missiles, and I know for a fact that when the guided missile era really got started, and the U.S. Navy was looking at how do you protect yourself against guided weapons like that, the Center for Naval Analysis spent a lot of time looking at kamikaze warfare from World War II, because that in effect they're guided missiles. So work points out that most unguided projectiles miss their targets. They not only miss their targets, but they're more likely, and they miss by a larger amount, the farther away you are. So range doesn't get you a whole lot with unguided weapons. Range just makes it harder to hit. Rate of fire and density of barrage, therefore, were way more important than range was. Range was just a really, really expensive way to miss, because you paid for range. Range costs, but range didn't get you, it didn't increase your hit rate, it decreased your hit rate. So more expensive, and you have to increase your rate of fire to make it work. So range wasn't really useful in that regard, right? You saw this in Navy ships. You know, once you got beyond the horizon, what's the point? And even at range, you know, when you do the calculations on the average hit rate for battleships at any given time, it's like 2 to 7%. It's actually kind of interesting, because they really sort of, they saw that was the variable that they were solving for, right? Range went up, the hit rate pretty much stayed the same. That was sort of the range, the hit rate that they were comfortable at. And if you started getting hits, you could get more hits. Once you found the range, it wasn't a linear thing. It wasn't a random distribution. It was once you found the range, you had it, and you could do more damage. So there was still this race to find the range, but there really wasn't any, you know, increase in effectiveness over time. It just meant that you could shoot from farther away. You also you would use maneuver, but in the unguided munitions era, you were really using that to try to gain local advantage in mass, right? So you're trying to get enough people together in one area that you can do the barrage that you need in order to saturate the target and get hits through. So that's really, you know, that's what he's talking about there when he's talking, that's his equivalent of better solutions to the targeting problem. Okay, so how do you increase your chances of hitting? Chadwick talks about increasing the precision of fire or increasing the volume of fire. Work actually points out that there's another way to do it, and that's to make the bang a lot bigger. Atomic munitions are really kind of a way of increasing the volume of fire. It kind of works to increase precision, and it kind of works to increase volume, both, by making it easier to hit the target because the boom is so much bigger. And so that's one of the solutions that we had in the immediate post-war era, is that we would just use nuclear weapons to solve that problem. You only, you know, horseshoes and hand grenades and nuclear weapons, right? You only have to get it close in order to be able to do it. Guided munitions then later solved the problem of large CEPs by actively correcting for individual aiming and subsequent errors by homing on their target. So in other words, they're more precise. Guided munitions do a better job of hitting the actual target because they're guided to the target. So it's not just this, I have to be really good at aiming early on, and then once I pull the trigger, the projectile is on its own. It is a case of the guided weapon will move towards the target. Work doesn't really discuss volume of fire per se, because he's really focused on the guided munition age. So that's one thing. Frank Chadwick really kind of effectively starts with prehistory here. He doesn't talk about specific time periods. He just talks about the problem in general. Whereas Work really sort of zeroes in on World War II as sort of the farthest back that he's willing to talk about, because he really wants to talk about what happens in the post-war era. So he doesn't really, he's focused on the guided munitions. He doesn't really do that previous stuff much. Okay, so what are the implications of this according to Work? In the unguided weapons regime, you need big salvos, right? That's pretty much what I've been saying. In the guided weapons regime, a salvo only had to be dense enough to saturate an opponent's defenses. So if all the weapons would hit, if the defense wasn't there, then any leaker, anyone that gets through the shield, is going to hit. So you send 10 kamikazes after a ship, and the ship has anti-aircraft fire trying to shoot down the kamikazes. If they fail, the kamikaze's probably going to hit. So leakers will ruin your day, because every shot that isn't intercepted is likely to hit and is likely to be an effective shot. Because one of the things he doesn't explicitly say, but implicit in his discussion, is the fact that that the warheads are really pretty large. And, you know, back in the days of iron shot hitting wooden ships, you know, one individual cannonball might be a bad news for the people standing in its way, or the people that are going to get hit by the splinters. But you know, one cannon shot isn't going to sink a ship. One kamikaze, if it hits in the right place, might. Or it might, at the very least, make it combat ineffective. So guided munitions have a good chance of hitting their target independent of range. It doesn't really matter what the range is. They're likely to hit because they're guided to the target. So range is still an expensive commodity to pay. You know, if you want to get the extra range, it's still expensive, but the return on investment's a lot higher. It's generally worth doing, or it might be more worth doing. Or you might say, you know, maybe it's not worth getting 100 miles of range, but going from 5 miles of range to 20 miles of range might be worth it. So that's really the fundamental observation here. Leakers are going to be hits, and this has implications for both active defenses, which is it better be pretty good, and armor, which is it better be pretty good. And you know, we see in the post-war era that armoring of ships actually goes down dramatically, and that's because, first of all, when you start off with nuclear weapons, it doesn't really matter how much armor you have; it's not really going to help. And then once nuclear weapons stopped being sort of the go-to, it's still really tough to armor against a modern shaped charge anti-ship warhead, right? If you're firing a naval shell and you've got a couple, 100 pounds of HE in it, that's bad news. But if you're firing a guided missile that has a 500 or 1,000 pound warhead that's a shaped charge, that's going to go right through the armor. And so you get to the point where it's not worth armoring it the same way that it used to be. Okay, so in that last bullet, Chadwick talks about defenses, decreasing the precision of fire and decreasing the effective volume. Work talks about how the U.S. Navy responded to this guided munitions regime. In the 1950s, the answer for the defense was to start with guided munitions. So you're going to shoot down airplanes with missiles. You had Talos, Tartar, and Terrier as the initial set of missiles designed to shoot down airplanes. And then later you have SM-1 and SM-2 standard missiles as your way of shooting down airplanes. But you went to guided munitions on the defense to try to get those potentially atomic armed airplanes before they can get to you. On the offense, because like just shooting them with a 30 millimeter gun isn't going to do any any good, right? Because if they are armed with atomic weapons, they're going to drop that weapon from outside the gun range, and you're going to have a bad day. On the offense, we had a tendency to go with atomic weapons, right? There wasn't really a whole lot of stomach for going with guided munitions on the offense. We had atomic weapons. We're just going to use those. This started to change during Vietnam. That's when Vietnam was really when guided munitions came on the scene. We dropped a couple of thousand of laser guided bombs and things like that in the Vietnam War. We had a lot of guided munitions. We still did lots of carpet bombing. I've always argued that one of the problems with we have a tendency to go with measures of performance, how much effort we can do versus measures of effectiveness, i.e. what the result of that effort was. Measures of performance are easy. How many tons of bombs do you drop? How many different targets did you hit in a day? You can count. Measures of performance are all based on counting. Measures of effectiveness are based upon okay, all right, so we took the bridge down. What did that mean? And that's a lot harder. And if you measure something, you are creating an incentive structure. So militaries traditionally have done measures of performance, and as a result, they've incentivized performance. This happened as far back as World War II, where there were cases where the rudimentary guided weapons that you had back then were reasonably effective. You could have radio-controlled glide bombs that could take out a ship. But, what's the measure of performance? I dropped one bomb. Okay, that doesn't look very impressive. And because you were focused on measures of performance rather than measures of effectiveness, the commanders had a tendency to favor carpet bombing attacks because they looked good on paper. So, yeah.
Can I ask a quick question
Please,
about that?
Please.
So I'm thinking over here that what you're describing there, there's also a monetary aspect of it from the standpoint of counting the number of bombs, means that we can now buy a whole bunch of new bombs to replace the old ones, which means that all the munitions manufacturers are all going cha-ching for that, which gets more into the political aspect of it, not necessarily the tactical aspect of it. But
your politics foo is very powerful.
So
yes.
So I'm guessing that they went with also the numbers just because then they could justify the uptick in the amount of munitions.
You could justify the budget.
They could that's a good way to put it.
You could justify the budget. You can justify all the platforms, etc. I was actually thinking about whether I was going to go down that path. I'm glad you brought it up because it's probably the right answer is to go down that path because that's exactly true. I mean, you had Ernest King, the chief of naval operations at the end of the war, World War II, who was doing things like, we knew that we were going to beat Japan. We'd already beaten Germany. We knew we were going to beat Japan. The U.S. Navy was rushing to complete ships that it knew it was never going to use.
And why is that? For the money. Because of the money.
Yes, because Ernest King knew that after the war, the first thing that was going to happen was there was going to be a straight proportional cut. It's like, we're going to get rid of 90% of this stuff. So let's make sure that 100% is the largest possible number we can get. So when they cut 90% of it, our 10% is still large enough to do what we want to do.
You know what this reminds me of?
What?
If Pat were here, since you say that Pat's almost a walking encyclopedia, which rule of acquisition was it the one where it says that war is good for business?
I don't remember.
Well, that's just it. I mean, that's the point we're making here.
Yeah, I don't remember which one, but yeah, war can be good for business.
Yeah,
if you're in the right business.
Yes.
So in the 1980s, you saw that starting in the 70s, but really in the 1980s, there was we doubled down on the second offset strategy. The first offset strategy is atomic weapons. The second offset strategy is precision guided weapons. And that's when we really started buying precision guided weapons in bulk. And, we made a big deal about all the precision guided weapons in Desert Storm. If you watch the news reports then, Colin Powell would be on TV and he's showing videos of laser guided bombs hitting this
Mhm.
and laser guided bombs hitting that, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, here's another laser guided bomb hit. Here's another laser guided bomb hit. The vast proportion of the weapons we dropped during Desert Storm were dumb bombs.
Mhm.
The laser guided stuff was very, very limited. But one of the things that happened after the laser guided stuff is we realized that there was a better way. And the better way was GPS guided weapons, where you can sort of dial in, go to this location. And because for a lot of stuff, laser guided weapons are very useful if something's moving, but you need to have like something lasing. A GPS guided weapon is a fire and forget weapon. You push the button, it comes off, and the GPS is moving the tail fins, et cetera, et cetera. And the thing is, you could turn dumb bombs into smart bombs by screwing on a new tail and screwing on a fuse in the nose that had the GPS unit or whatever, and it would do its thing. And now you've got a smart weapon. So you for a relatively cheap amount of money, you've now got something that's guided with all the advantages of a guided weapon.
I'm thinking that one possibility that would probably add to that whole thing would be the 1980s and the 1990s. We saw a lot more technology get smaller.
Yeah.
Which made that
Yes.
entirely possible. I mean, we basically all carry around these things in our pockets that are more powerful than what it took to land a man on the moon.
In fact, if you've ever seen the movie Iron Sky, the space Nazis have this giant space battleship, but they send a scout to Earth to basically get an iPad, so that because they need their computer technology is so backward they can't make their giant space battleship work, but an iPad will do it. So they send them to Earth to get an iPad.
So you get smaller devices that would allow them GPS or guided missiles and whatnot.
Yeah,
because you're getting smaller. And
now,
so because if you think about it, and you and I both know this because we both work in the IT industry from the standpoint,
yeah, I was an IT geek in the 1990s.
In the 50s, basically the smallest computers were the size of a refrigerator.
Yeah.
And today, those same computers are, much for the same power, that would be a small percentage of this device.
Yeah, I mean,
but that's just that's the point I'm trying to make, is that the technology got so much smaller. It's much easier because you run into the problem of weight and stuff like that.
Now it's interesting though, because one of the, depending upon how you define guided, right? The munitions there was stuff in World War II that technically wasn't guided, in that it didn't change its trajectory based upon inputs, but it did change its fusing, and that was all the proximity fused air defense stuff. And when we first started using so a proximity fuse is basically a simple radar. It sends out a continuous wave radar signal, and it uses Doppler to sort of figure out when it's reached the closest point of approach. Right. So when you start getting farther away from something, it goes, now's the time, boom, and it blows up. And proximity fuses were way more significant than the atomic bomb in terms of World War II. It was the most significant development of the war, almost certainly. Because the Japanese used to talk about how great our air defense was, and about how our gunners could just hit everything. Well, no, I mean, our gunners were good, but the bigger deal was our shells blew up when we wanted them to blow up.
So they were just having to get close, and then they would blow up.
Because the traditional way that you would do it is you do a timer. So it's like, okay, they're at they're at 10,000 feet, so I set the timer for a certain thing, and then it'll go off at like 10,000 feet. Okay, well, small differences make big differences. If I'm a little bit off in the altitude, or I'm a little bit off on this, or a little bit off.
If you didn't carry the one.
Yeah.
I mean, if somebody can't do the math in their head that fast in order to set it, but
they tried to make it as stupid as possible. But the proximity stuff, you didn't have to set it. You didn't have to be setting individual weapons. You just put the shell in, and it would go off when it was optimal for it to go off. And when we first started deploying this stuff, I think it was only after D-Day that they authorized anybody to deploy it over land.
The proximity?
Yeah, because they were worried about a dud landing someplace and the Germans getting their hands on it. And so for a long time, it was only allowed for use over water. So the Japanese got to experience the proximity shell in all of its glory way before the Germans did.
Okay. And here I was thinking that they wouldn't want to do it because of the potential damage to the civilian population around.
No, I mean, when push comes to shove, the damage to the civilian population of having the Germans living in your country is way worse than anything the Allies could do.
True.
So
I didn't even think about the potential of it being something that they don't want to fall into the wrong hands.
Yeah. So, all right. So back here we go. All right. So spent a lot of time talking about World War II. Spent a lot of time talking about this other stuff. But what about Star Trek and other science fiction? So let's take a look. I'm going to take a look at Star Trek. I'm going to take a look at Babylon 5. I'm going to take a look at Battlestar Galactica. So starting off with Babylon 5. I need to reword that bullet. That bullet is kind of silly. Most offensive shots are intercepted. So they count as misses because they're intercepted, right? So you see a lot of, they've got a device called an interceptor, which is basically a close-in weapon system, and they're shooting at individual shots, and they're intercepting a lot of those shots. Defense is very precise. So you've got precise fire defending the ship. I need to go back and rewatch Babylon 5. I'm looking forward to doing that because I don't have a good feel in my head for how many offensive shots are misses, would be misses if they are if they're not intercepted. But my impression is that it's active defenses that are taking out most of the shots. They're not missing.
I don't remember ever seeing anything miss in Babylon 5. Now you do see a lot of the ships are coming at them, or there's you see these lines of firing going through the screen. So it's like, okay, after it's left the screen, did it hit something or didn't it? But anything that you see on screen, it always seems like they hit. There's a very few misses. So
yeah, I don't have a good feel for that. I need to take a look at it again. But I would argue this is somewhat analogous to World War II in that you have some guided weapons, but as a general rule, you're pointing something and it's precision. There's volume of fire, right? You're trying to get through the other guy's defenses by swamping the defenses in general. So it's a volume of fire type of solution. I'll probably come back to this in a future presentation because this is a very broad brush approach. In fact, that bullet's on a couple of these slides. So let's take a look at the reimagined Battlestar Galactica. I think in that, so as I said in Babylon 5, I think most offensive shots are intercepted, and that's how you're protected. I think in Battlestar Galactica, most offensive shots just miss. I seem to recall seeing, now this picture that I've got here, it looks the way it does primarily because that's a lot of defensive fire that's taking place there. But I think there's a lot of, I seem to recall there's a lot of instances where you just sort of see offensive shots streaking by.
Yeah, I do remember some of that from
I need to go back and double check that. And I think that that's also sort of analogous to World War II. Some guided weapons, but the volume of fire prevails, right? So you've got a lot of fire there in a lot of instances, and that's certainly the case when you've got fighters flying around shooting 50 cals at each other, or the equivalent of, actually they're probably closer to
also when just from the standpoint of when these scenes are coming up. So much is happening in there. It's kind of hard to tell, that when there's 50 explosions going on around you, you don't see that one that missed.
Yeah, and you know what?
And that picture does show that.
This picture is a really good example of exactly what I hate about a lot of space combat science fiction is the fact that it's just stuff. It's like fairy dust all over the place. Just look at all the fairy dust, Alon. Look at all the fairy dust. And this stuff just kind of drives me crazy.
Well, and you've said, I know you said to me a couple of different times that the distance, and you've said this on the show, that the distances are are kind of crazy because these are, I mean, in order to get it into the shot,
Yeah.
you have to be really, really close. And it's like you and I sitting here and shooting guns at each other at this distance. And we wouldn't be doing that in a real world situation.
Although it's funny, most gun battles take place like within the same room. I mean, like with cops and
in the case of police, they're going in and confronting from that standpoint. But in a combat situation like this, it would be distances. You're doing it from blocks away or miles away or maybe hundreds of miles, or in this case, maybe thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away.
Yeah, and I could have talked about Andromeda in this regard too. But one of the things I've said frequently, although not recently, but one of the things I like about Andromeda is how they approached space combat. And so usually what happened was some version of, you see one ship fire missiles, and then you see the other ship fire missiles, but they're not in the same screen. You're cutting back and forth, right? Because they're like half a solar system away from each other. Maybe not that far, but they're those really long range weapons. And you never see them on screen at the same time. One fires, the other fires. You watch on the radar screen, they cut to the bridge, and you see on the radar screen the missiles interpenetrate and go by each other. And then you start seeing, you focus in on one ship and point defenses are taking out the shots, and then they start hitting, and you see the same thing from the other side. Mm-hmm. And so they never try to put both of them in the same screen at the same time. And that's, of course, what the original Star Trek did as well. And all these battles took place at warp speed and they're far away, etc. Now, when push comes to shove, the reason why they didn't show that in the original Star Trek is because it's really hard to do the special effects of having both the ships in the same shot and both be in focus, etc. It was a much simpler special effects situation if you only had to show one ship or the other. And so that's what they did.
I'm also wondering from the standpoint of, if I remember correctly, the models that they used at that point in time were actually fairly large.
Yeah, they were huge.
And it would be very, very hard to get them maybe even in the same studio at the same time, and then somehow get it back far enough that they could get a camera angle to get both of them in.
some of the models you saw for Next Gen were pretty large too. It's actually for all those that you could end up with large models. The hero ship models, the main ones. I remember that for Next Gen, they did a Galaxy class hero ship, and they as sort of like their super uber detailed ship that they could do close-ups on, and they basically got rid of it because it was too big, it was too heavy, it was too limited in terms of how they could do the shots. And so they said, yeah, we need to build a new one. And so they had this like 10-foot model, and then they built like a 6-foot model or something like that.
Even then, I would think a 6-foot model would be problematic. Just not as much.
Still a lot easier to do that with.
Yeah,
still a lot easier. So in general, I hate scenes like this. Like, I didn't like the battle in episode 6 of Star Wars because there was just too much going on to track, and that drove me crazy. So in any event, Battlestar Galactica, somewhat analogous to World War II. So what about, I don't know, Star Trek? So I would argue that in Star Trek, here's how I've put it together. I look forward to Pat coming on the show, or Andy in a phone conversation telling me that I got this all wrong, but this is what I've put together. In Star Trek, essentially, all weapons are precision of fire shots, right? Star Trek isn't really about volume of fire. It's really about precision of fire. Well, why do I think that? Well, first of all, you've got highly capable sensors with precise weapons control. Most beam weapon shots hit. And I'm thinking, think Next Gen, right? Most beam weapon shots hit the shields. They hit something. You don't have a whole lot of misses with beams. You have some misses with photon torpedoes. So not all the photon torpedoes hit, but most of the beam weapons hit, and the majority of the photon torpedoes hit. They're just taken care of by shields. And you need quick hits, multiple hits in a quick succession to actually do damage. So that's not really the same sort of model that we see in those other shows, and it's not really the same sort of model we see in the real world. Defense is primarily through armor, right? You don't see interception. They never, why don't you use phasers to intercept photon torpedoes? Why wouldn't you do that? Well, you never see it. That doesn't happen. So you're reducing the volume of effective fire by having your shields, because the shields are functioning as armor. There's no defensive fire per se, right? You don't intercept even photon torpedoes. And then you maneuver to limit fire's effectiveness. And so some of these things will become clearer when I get to the stuff on the right. You maneuver to limit fire's effectiveness. That's why the ships are moving around all the time, is that you're forcing them to move to another part of the shield, and you're making your shields last longer. Star Trek combat effectively requires precision of fire and volume of fire, right? You need to constantly be poking at them, but they need to be precise pokes. You don't win by just throwing a lot of bullets down range. You don't win by just throwing a lot of shots that most of them miss. You don't win by having a few shots that get through. You win by doing this a lot. You have to keep hitting them. Well, keep hitting them harder. I won't slug you. So it's not really analogous to World War II per se, and it's not really analogous to the current precision munitions regime. So let's look at a couple of specific.
Sorry, I just an observation that in Star Trek in general, there seems to be very few times they kind of make it sound like photon torpedoes are kind of the like the hand grenade at times. Yeah. But it only seems to be the case when they actually are, it's something tied to the storyline. Otherwise, it's always basically, it's like, I've managed to take this, basically I've slugged you and hit you with a photon torpedo instead of poking you with a phaser. And it's like, I've always, that's something that's kind of weird. It's like, why do I have the photon torpedo if I've got the phaser to hit you precisely? Why am I not just basically lobbing photon hand grenades at you?
So this is a good conversation. I'll bring it up with Pat next week, because the answer varies depending upon what source you're dealing with. Now, the next gen answer to that is phasers are useless at even high relativistic speeds, let alone at warp. Phasers are not useful at warp. Photon torpedoes are useful at warp, and so that's when you use photon torpedoes, is at warp.
See, I'd love to get into this conversation with Pat too, but I won't be here next week. I won't be on here.
You can watch.
I will watch.
So in any event,
I can't throw my 2 cents worth in then.
Let me go through a couple of these quotes here and explain why I think they're significant. So now a reading from the book of Sternbach and Okuda. Threat vessels will be encountered with, this is from the phaser section of the Star Trek Next Gen Tech Manual. Threat vessels will be encountered with a wide variety of shields that act upon phaser emissions to reduce their effectiveness. Okay, it's armor, reducing effectiveness. The type most often confronted, so it's basically Federation type shields, spreads the beam cross-section, redirecting the energy around the shields and back into space. Higher power levels will usually overburden the shields and allow the phaser to hit the target directly, so you can sort of punch through, you can burn through, although more sophisticated adversaries possessed highly resistant shield generators. It has been the experience of some Starship Tactical officers that rapid firing volleys at different parts of the shield bubble can weaken it. So Pat has talked about shield dimpling, etc., in other episodes of the show, and that's basically what we're talking about. Rapid fire volleys at different parts of the shield bubble can weaken it. So you need some volume there to make it happen, but you need to actually hit the shield to do it. So you need volume and precision. The phaser arrays on a Galaxy-class ship are located to achieve maximum beam dwell time on target. So I need to hit the shields. I need to keep hitting the shields, right? So you see all these places where the Enterprise is maneuvering and it's firing out of the array, and the ship will be maneuvering, and we'll get to that in the next paragraph. But it's following along the array and it's keeping a beam on target, because you need to maximize the amount of energy that you're putting on target, right? That's not like how missiles work. That's not even really like how machine guns work. It's certainly not like how naval artillery works, right? Artillery, naval guns, like you're firing an individual shell, right? That shell either hits or it doesn't, and that shell either does damage or it doesn't. And it, yeah, if you hit the same spot again, you could do more damage the second time, but you're not really thinking in terms of hitting the same spot again. If you hit the same spot again, it's luck, right? Mm-hmm. You're really thinking, and it may get easier to hit because you've slowed the ship down, but that's really kind of a different effect than what we're talking about here. It's a different way of thinking about the problem. So, generally speaking, regardless of the actual beam type, pulse or continuous, or the specific threat situation, the most effective tactic is to maintain contact between the beam and the threat shield or physical hull. So, achieve maximum dwell time on target. That's because the most effective tactic is to put your phaser on there and continue hitting them with the phaser. Continue pumping energy into that ship. Computer sequencing of the arrays will always attempt to expose the target even while the arrays are recharging. So keep it up. Conversely, the best tactics for minimizing disabling return phaser fire are to present the smallest visible ship cross-section to the threat weapons and continue changing attitudes so as to deny the beams any sites on which to inflict concentrated energies. So, present the minimal target, so turn towards the target, but don't stay turned towards the target. Maneuver. So, you would think, we're just here. I'll just fire at him. Why is he doing all this stuff? It's not really about getting around behind them. It's really about making sure that they're not shooting the same spot in the shields all the time. Mm-hmm. It's really about making sure that they can't maintain contact between the beam and they can't achieve the maximum dwell time by forcing them to change emitters and to move around on the shield.
And hopefully their reaction is not going to be fast enough for my reaction.
Yeah. And so this is not really the same as either World War II combat or the current precision munitions regime. It's not like firing cruise missiles. It's not like firing naval cannon. It's a different way of thinking about how you conduct combat when you're talking about beam weapons. Missile weapons, the thing about photon torpedoes is they hit the shields, they can do damage to the shields, etc., but they're just kind of piling on. Right? So it's not one Tomahawk anti-ship cruise missile hits you and you're going to have a bad day. One photon torpedo hits you. Okay, if your shields are down, your ship is in a pre-plasma state. Mm-hmm. But if your shields are up, you do the countdown on the shield energy, but it's not like any individual photon torpedo is going to kill you unless you're like a runabout or something like that.
Or all your shields are down.
Or all your shields are down, right? So, so the first photon torpedo isn't going to kill you, as a general rule. So that's pretty much what I had for this week. And let me take a quick look and see if there's any comments. All right, I'm going to do a quick scan because I want to try to respond to people. Okay, let's see. Scrolling. Okay. Let's see. Wright asked super secret squirrel stuff for Pat. No, I think he's just working. I think that's all going on. I forgot to say to everybody who took, Wright says he took the survey. Hey, I totally forgot when I first put the survey up. I forgot to include Babylon 5, which is just dumb, obviously. Yeah, it was dumb. So I realized that 3 people had gone into the survey. And I went in and I put I added Babylon 5 in because I figured that most people are probably interested in Babylon 5 also. So this will tell us if there's something that people really don't want to see, and if we sort of get a widespread, Pat and I will feel like we've gotten free reign to just go pick what we want. Right now we're kind of our default is kind of that we were thinking in terms of Space Above and Beyond is sort of a good way to get into it. We're both kind of jonesing to watch it again, but and it looked like it was a popular choice. So we're not going to just slavishly do it, but we want to get an idea of what general direction we want people to go in. So we may call some audibles when we do all this. So in any event, that's what's going on there. Let me go back to. TJ says he's been reviewing TNG episodes for his Admiral's presentation. I'm really looking forward to seeing that. In fact, maybe if he gets that done one of those days when I'm traveling in May, maybe TJ and Pat can talk about Admirals. Okay, so Edgar asked a question about where Axanar is, basically. So I am not the authoritative spokesman for Axanar, but I can tell you that so various legal things got in the way, and then Alec moved cross country, and COVID hit. And so when you added all those things up, the most recent thing is they've been waiting for COVID to finish. They realized they needed to reshoot some stuff, and they've been waiting for COVID restrictions to go down enough that they could safely get everybody together, because the various governing bodies that govern screen productions are very, very specific about COVID restrictions. And if you're a big Hollywood production, you can, just write checks and make all the COVID protection stuff happen. If you're a small independent fan film, it's a lot harder to make all the COVID stuff happen. And Alec cares a lot about the safety of his crew and his people doing the shoots. But I think they're at the point where So listen.
Hi. So yes, they are at the point that they are trying to get started back on that, because a lot of the stuff has kind of started dying down some. But obviously there are surges here and there that have been cropping up.
Yeah.
They we'll see what happens in the next few months. They are trying to get things back on track, but we'll have to see based on COVID numbers.
And there's a report of a new variant hitting the U.S.
There's also a report of China shutting down again.
Yeah. So the next COVID wave is on its way, everybody. So plan accordingly.
Now, the thing is, at this point, COVID is endemic. It is at endemic levels. It is never going to go away. This is a new normal. It's going to be very much like the flu going forward. So we are happy
to being like the flu. That would be great. The problem we have right now is that
it's not quite there yet. But it is at the point where it's not going to go away.
Yeah, I agree.
No, I never believed for 1 second once it was introduced that it was ever going to go completely away.
But the upshot of this is that Axanar is still alive. It's still a going concern. It's just the problem. Yes, agree with that, Rob. Get your vaccine. So they're just I think they're down to like what, 1 day of shooting, or do they have to do some bridge stuff? I knew they had to do some live stuff that they have to fly out to California to do.
Yes, they've got to do some stuff out in California. And I think there's some reshoots here. And that's about where we're at now.
Yeah, I knew that they did some reshoots before they moved the set. They moved the set to a new location. And in fact, Alec volunteered at one point. If Lissa was unavailable, Alec said that he would try to produce the show tonight, but they're like literally reassembling sets.
Yep. They're literally in the new studio getting things together. Thankfully I was able to get done with the one shot relatively early. It was actually only about 2 hours for that one shot. I even with me putting aside 4 hours, I still would have been here on time. So
yeah, I saw I visited the set a couple of years ago in April, if I remember correctly. I went down and visited the set at the second of the 3 locations. They're now in the 3rd location.
Yeah.
And there's some pictures online. If you go, I forget exactly where, one of Alec's web pages, there's pictures of me helping them assemble the set. My big contribution was saying, oh, wait a minute. These are pie piece sections, right? Remember, it's a saucer. These are pie pieces. Those walls aren't supposed to be parallel. And when we stopped trying to make the walls parallel, everything fit.
That oh shit moment.
but so because they had this set back in California, and then they cut it up and loaded it on a semi, and they took it to this location, and stuff just sat for a while. It takes a while. There's a couple of different sets, and it takes a while to reestablish things. So they're concentrating on the bridge. We were doing the captain's quarters set, which was never intended to be taken apart, but they cut it apart and they redid it. And so they're reassembling the set. So yeah, they moved like 6 months ago or something like that. But all that means, I mean, that just means it's they moved everything from they tore everything down to one location, moved it to someplace else, and just sort of piled it there and said, all right, we'll come back and assemble it.
And now they're digging into the boxes and putting the stuff in the kitchen and in the dining room and
it's
just like any other move.
Yeah, it's only, I mean, it's not quite like the idea that I'm going to take my house apart and move it to some new location and reassemble my house.
Yeah.
But it's closer to that than it is to just doing a regular move.
Like taking all the parts and pieces out of any household and moving them to a different location.
Yeah, except what you're disassembling is rooms. Like you're taking all the walls apart.
It's like disassembling a tiny home.
Yeah, and when I was there, most of the displays were just backlit plastic sheets, right? Printed plastic sheets. I know that Dana was doing everything in his power to make sure that everything was an electronic screen.
Yeah, he's done a really good job at that. And Bob, yes, she is a pretty calico. Her name is Esri.
And so when you sort of look at all that stuff, it's really kind of amazing. I think that, I mean, when I think about the idea that how many bridge stations there are, what, like 10? And each one of them has multiple computer monitors in it. And I'm going to take all that apart and move it.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot. I want to say there's at least 4 Raspberry Pis. At least. I don't think all of the...
Station? Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think all of the screens got their own Raspberry Pi, but I know that a lot of them do have a Raspberry Pi to flip through the different...
Yeah, Stephen Ross says the Americans once converted a B-17 into a television guided missile during the war. In fact, John F. Kennedy's brother died on I can't remember if it was a B-17, but they were doing that. They were going to try to take out a dam with a remote controlled bomber, and when they armed it, it blew up. And so the idea was that you'd have pilots that would fly it to a particular location. Then I think they would bail out. They would take it off. You couldn't do remote control for takeoff. I think they'd take it off, and the idea is they'd bail out. And John F. Kennedy's older brother died that way. Okay, so let's see. Wright talks about some of all fears. I need to read that. I'm afraid I can't comment on that. He also talks about the SSN-19 shipwreck was a shaped charge, that he thinks that it was a shaped charge. There's lots of shaped charges out there. I mean, that's sort of, these days, almost everything's a shaped charge.
Yes. And Karen, yes, that sounds about right. So definitely one more in LA. There's some more reshoots in Georgia, and then it will be post-production. And we are hopeful that it'll be the end of the year, but COVID progression, we'll see how it goes. We will see how it goes, because Alec tries to do everything as close to industry standard as possible. Obviously, indie productions can get away with a lot more technically because they don't have those pesky standards that they got to go by. And I'm obviously being sarcastic.
Yeah, but he takes it very seriously.
Yes, he does take it very seriously. He wants to try and make sure everyone is as safe as possible.
Yeah, modern phone chargers have more capability than the Apollo computer. So for what it's worth, there's a guy at NASA who does a talk at science fiction conventions. I think he's at NASA Langley, because I saw him in Virginia. He brings an Apollo guidance computer. Like you can hold the pieces, and he explains how it works and how it was set up. And it was really cool and totally weird, totally different
Well,
than anything else.
Think about this.
Yeah.
This right here has more processing power than my first computer.
Yeah.
My first computer, not talking about, huh?
I owned a Commodore 64 back in the day.
Yeah.
I bet
Like,
this has more processing power than NASA did in 1969, like the entire
Exactly.
organization.
Exactly. This tiny piece of technology right here.
Yes, and yet I still can't get my dad to get one.
Look, I have been teaching my grandfather how to use a smartphone, and that has been a journey.
I've been thinking about trying to teach my dad.
He's been fighting us on that for years now.
Oh yeah, no. The only reason why he now has a smartphone is because they stopped supporting 3G.
Yeah, and also, so Wright talks about how a naval shell during the Falkland Wars detonated an incoming missile. Probably had a proximity fuse in it. That helps a lot. And volume of fire helps too, but having radar pointing your guns helps a lot too. Stephen Ross says, didn't the Americans use proximity rounds during the Battle of the Bulge? I believe the answer is that after D-Day, they authorized proximity shells for use in Europe because we were close enough to the end, and the thought was the Germans were never going to get the opportunity to actually sit down and take advantage of it if they caught it. So B5 seems to be volume. There's certainly a lot of fire. There's precision of defensive fire, which is sort of interesting. But this is a good reason why we should have a watch along with Babylon 5. So
all right, twist my arm.
yeah, I knew I'd have to twist your arm. Let's see, we're a little over, but yeah, so that's what Wright has to say about the size of the model. And TJ said that there is a 6 foot, a 2 foot, and later a 4 foot. That matches my thinking in that. And I want to say that 6 foot was like really, really heavy, like 500 pounds or 600 pounds or something like that. There was some issue with it was so heavy that they couldn't get certain shots because of where the support had to be. And so there was some limits on what they could do. Let's see. Yeah, I think I did. If I remember correctly, they did do something like that at one point. But Balance of Terror. If you go back to one of the early episodes where Pat took apart Balance of Terror and analyzed Balance of Terror, one of the issues with that is that's the first combat episode that we really see in Star Trek.
Yeah.
And so not only is it original series versus next gen and sort of the big picture discontinuities between them, but they were literally making it up as they went along. They really didn't quite know what they were doing.
I seem to recall from my recollection of Balance of Terror, if I remember correctly, the first salvo against the Enterprise took out the phasers. And it was it was subsequent ones, and this was one of those ones of subsequent firings at the Enterprise, where I think Scotty basically said something to the effect of that if they had one phaser, they would be able to take it out, but they couldn't because it wasn't operating at that moment in time. He was still repairing them.
Yeah, that could be.
I might be remembering that totally wrong. It's been a while since I've seen Balance of Terror, but that's how I remember it.
Let's see. Scrolling almost towards the end. Scrolling. Okay, so I've gone through everything, and I think that's it at this point. So thank you very much for joining us this evening. It was a pleasure as always. I appreciate the fact that we've got a group of people that think that the best way that they can spend a Friday evening is to come and listen to me talk.
Saturday.
Oh, you're right. It is Saturday.
Yeah, it's Saturday, Chris.
Saturday evening. Well, you know what? Saturday evenings are even more impressive because Friday evenings you're basically just, you're tired, you've had a long work week, stay home, do stuff. Saturday is the night where it's like I'm refreshed and I'm ready to go out, and you guys decide to come and spend time with me. So I appreciate that. So with that in mind, I will let you all go so that you can get back to your Saturday and do whatever you have time to do in the remaining time that's left. So thank you very much, everybody. See you next week.
All this other stuff. So I ended up